When one of the biggest men in the world sat down for what he thought was a simple interview, nobody in that room knew they were about to witness something that 7 million people would watch, share, and cry over in the next 24 hours. This is Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq, four-time NBA champion. The man with the biggest smile in basketball history. A man who had been in front of cameras his entire life. A man who had smiled through trash talk, heartbreak, tough questions, and everything in between for over 30 years. He had never walked off a set, not once, until February 11th. On that cold Tuesday morning in Atlanta, Shaq sat down across from an interviewer named Derek Calloway. He was there to talk about something close to his heart, a foundation he had built and named after his father, the man who raised him, the man who loved him when someone else had chosen to walk away. He was not there for a fight, but Derek Calloway had a folder on that desk, and inside that folder was something so personal, so painful, and so deliberately cruel that it would make a 7'1", 300-pound man go completely, terrifyingly quiet. And then stand up, and then say two words that nobody in that studio, or anywhere in the world, ever expected to hear come out of Shaquille O'Neal's mouth. Two words, soft as a closed door, final as a funeral. Then he unclipped his microphone, placed it gently on the desk, and walked off the set without looking back. The cameras kept rolling, and the entire world had one question. What did Derek Calloway say that broke the man nothing had ever been able to break? That answer did not come for 3 months. And when it finally came out, it was not just shocking, it was heartbreaking. Because the person behind it all was not who anyone expected. It was someone from Shaq's past, someone who had chosen, a long time ago, to walk away from a little boy in Newark, New Jersey, and who had never truly forgiven Shaq for surviving that. Stay with us for the whole video, because this story does not just end with a walk-off. It ends with a truth that will stay with you long after this video is over. The microphone hit the table like a thunderclap. 7 million people would watch the video in the next 24 hours. They would share it, cry about it, argue about it, and feel something deep in their chests that they could not fully name. But none of them were ready for what happened in that small studio in downtown Atlanta on a Tuesday morning in February. Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq, the man with the widest smile in basketball history, stood up from his chair so fast that it scraped backward across the floor with a loud screech. His enormous hands, the same hands that once palmed a basketball like it was a tennis ball, pressed flat on the interview desk. His eyes were no longer warm and laughing. They were something else entirely, something old and deep and very, very serious. "Shut your mouth," he said. His voice was quiet. That made it worse. The interviewer, a man named Derek Calloway, sat completely still. The studio lights buzzed above them like they always did, indifferent to everything happening beneath them. A producer somewhere behind the cameras made a sound like a small animal that had been stepped on too quickly to cry out. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even the studio audience, 12 people seated in 2 short rows, seemed to forget that breathing was something they were supposed to do. Then Shaq did something nobody expected. He did not storm. He did not shout. He did not point or slam or flip the desk the way a smaller man full of smaller anger might have done. Instead, he reached down and unclipped the microphone from his shirt. He held it for just 1 second. 1 second where the whole room waited. And then he placed it gently on the table. Gently. That one quiet act somehow said everything that shouting never could. Then he walked off the set. The cameras kept rolling. and the entire world, once it saw the footage, I stopped and asked the same question at the same time, in 100 different languages, on 100 different screens. What did Derek Calloway say? That question would hang in the air for 3 full days. It would survive a press conference, a resignation letter, a post written at 2 in the morning, and the slow, painful arrival of a truth that nobody had seen coming. It would take all of that before people finally understood what had really happened inside that studio. But the answer to that question, the real answer, the one with teeth, would not come out for 3 months. And when it did, it would not just explain why Shaquille O'Neal walked off a set. It would reveal exactly who had put Derek Calloway up to it in the first place. But that part of the story belongs to the end. This part belongs to the beginning. Shaquille Rashawn O'Neal was born on March 6, 1972, in Newark, New Jersey, in a city that did not apologize for being hard. Newark was the kind of place that tested people the way fire tests metal. The streets were loud, and the winters were bitter, and the gap between what people had and what they needed was wide enough to fall into and never come back out. His mother, Lucille O'Neal, was a young woman who carried that gap on her back every single day, without complaint. She was small in size and enormous in everything else. In love, in discipline, in the kind of quiet faith that does not wave its arms but never moves from its spot. His biological father, a man named Joe Toney, was already gone. Not gone like far away. Gone like a decision had been made, and that decision did not include staying. A Joe Toney had made choices that led him to prison before Shaquille was old enough to understand what prison meant. And then, even when the walls came down, he did not come back. There was no letter, no phone call that Shaq could remember with any warmth. There was simply an absence, a father-shaped hole in the middle of everything. And young Shaquille learned to walk around it the way you learn to walk around a broken step. Carefully, every single day. He did not talk about that hole much, not for a long time. Instead, he grew. He grew in every direction at once, upward, outward, louder, funnier. He made people laugh because laughter filled space, and space was something he had too much of in the wrong places. By the time he was a teenager, he was already so tall that strangers stopped and stared at him on the street. The kids at school called him names, not kind ones, the names that small people call large people when size is the only difference they can find to mock. He came home with those names sitting on him like mud. And then came Philip Harrison. Philip Harrison was an Army sergeant, built straight as a flagpole, serious as a storm cloud, and loyal as anything that has ever existed on this earth. When he married Lucille, he did not look at Shaquille like a complication. He did not look at him like a responsibility to be managed or a problem to be solved. He looked at him like a son, without qualification, without hesitation. From the very first day, Philip Harrison showed up. He was strict in the way that only people who truly care can be strict. Not mean, not cold, but firm in the places where firmness is actually love, wearing a different face. Early mornings, hard work, accountability. When Shaq wanted to quit something, Philip Harrison did not let him quit. He would sit across from him, arms folded, and say simply, "You don't quit. You figure it out." And young Shaq figured it out. Every time. The family moved the way military families move, frequently, and without sentiment about addresses. Wiesbaden, Germany. Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. Basketball courts in 3 different countries. Shaq played everywhere they went, and everywhere they went, people stopped what they were doing to watch him. Not just because of his size, because of the way he played, with a kind of explosive joy that seemed almost too big for the game itself. Philip Harrison came to every game he could. And he stood on the sideline with his arms crossed and his face serious, and after the game, win or lose, he would say the same thing. "What did you learn today?" "Not great job. Not you were the best out there." "What did you learn today?" That question, asked 1,000 times over 1,000 games, built something inside Shaquille O'Neal that no amount of fame or money or championship rings would ever be able to take apart. It built a man who believed that showing up mattered more than showing off. It built a man who would one day name his most important life's work after the person who asked it. It built a man who, on a cold February morning in Atlanta, would walk off a television set rather than sit still and let someone drag that person's name through the dirt. But we are not there yet. First, there is more growing up to do. By the time Shaquille O'Neal arrived at Louisiana State University in 1989, under the guidance of Coach Dale Brown, the growing up had produced something the basketball world had genuinely never seen before. He was not simply large. Large was a word for furniture. Shaq was large the way a weather system is large. You did not just see him. You felt him coming. He averaged over 13 rebounds per game in his freshman year. Opposing coaches watched film of him and then watched it again, as if a second viewing might reveal some weakness they had missed the first time. There was no weakness to find. In 1992, the Orlando Magic selected him first overall in the NBA draft. He was 20 years old. He was ready. And the smile, that famous, room-filling, argument-ending smile, was already fully formed. Already doing the work it would do for the next 2 decades. Hiding the harder things. Making the world feel safe around him so that the world would not look too closely underneath. Philip Harrison drove to the draft in a good shirt. He sat in the audience and clapped with his hands above his head, which was the most expressive Shaq had ever seen him be in public. That image stayed with Shaq forever. Derek Calloway grew up in a different kind of place and a different kind of way. He was born in Columbus, Ohio, in 1990, the youngest of 3 boys in a house where the television was always on and attention was always scarce. His father was a loud man who loved sports and argued about them constantly. At the screen, at the neighbors, at anyone who would engage. His mother was quieter, more careful. She was the kind of woman who measured her words because she had learned early that words had consequences. Derek grew up somewhere in between. He learned that being loud got you noticed. He also learned that being clever kept you noticed after the loudness faded. By the time he got to Ohio State, where he studied communications, he had developed a style that his professors called provocative and his classmates called exhausting. He was not without talent. That is important to say. He had a sharp mind for research, a good memory, and a genuine instinct for knowing what question would make a person uncomfortable. In the right hands, that instinct could have made him a serious journalist, the kind that exposed real wrongdoing and changed things. But talent without character is a car without brakes. And by the time he landed at the Pulse Sports Network in Atlanta at age 31, Derek Calloway had convinced himself that discomfort and cruelty were the same thing as honesty. That making people flinch was the same thing as telling the truth. He had built an entire professional identity on that convincing, and the scaffolding had held. Right up until the moment his ratings started slipping and the scaffolding began to shake. When scared people shake, they reach for the biggest target they can find. Derek Calloway looked up and found a 7'1" target named Shaquille O'Neal walking through his studio door. And he thought he had found his moment. He had found something, certainly. But it was not what he thought. The morning of February 11th arrived in Atlanta, the way winter mornings do in that city. Cold enough to remind you it is winter, but not cold enough to fully commit to it. The kind of morning that cannot make up its mind. Shaq arrived at the studio on Peachtree Street at 8:45. He was in a gray blazer and a bright blue shirt, and he was in the kind of mood that people who spend time around him describe as his real mood. Loose, warm, genuinely happy to be among people. He laughed with a cameraman named Darius about something that happened in the parking lot. He signed an autograph for a cleaning worker named Marcus, who had recognized him in the hallway, and gone so still with surprise that he forgot to hold out something to sign on. So Shaq signed the back of the man's work glove instead. "Big fella, you all right?" Shaq said, or grinning, patting Marcus on the shoulder. Marcus laughed the laugh of a man who would tell that story for the rest of his life. Then Shaq walked into Studio C and sat down across from Derek Calloway, and the cameras began to roll. The first 12 minutes were fine. Calloway asked about the Harrison Foundation with the face of a man who cared deeply about the Harrison Foundation. Shaq leaned forward in his chair, which groaned slightly under his shifting weight, and spoke about it the way he always did, carefully. Like each word was something he had carried a long distance and did not want to drop. "We named it after my dad," Shaq said. "Philip Harrison. He was the hardest-working man I ever knew in my life. Did not ask anything from the world except the chance to show up in it honestly. That is the whole lesson. You show up. You do the work. You do not quit on the people depending on you." Calloway nodded slowly. His pen moved across his notepad. "And these kids we are reaching," Shaq continued, his voice getting quieter and more serious in the way it did when he meant something completely. "They come from places I recognize, places where the world has already decided what you are before you are old enough to decide for yourself. Somebody has to walk in there and tell them that is a lie." The small studio audience responded warmly. A woman in the second row pressed her hand to her chest. Calloway let the moment breathe. Then he clicked his pen closed. "I want to pivot for a second," he said. His voice had changed. It was a small change, the difference between a friendly hand on a shoulder and a hand that is about to push. Sienna Morrow, standing behind camera 2 with a tablet pressed against her chest, felt the hair rise on her arms. She had heard that voice in the pre-interview rehearsal 2 days ago, when Calloway had practiced his pivot questions alone in the empty studio, thinking no one else was in the building. She had been in the building. She had stood in the doorway and listened and felt sick. Now she watched Shaq smile easily and say, "Sure, go ahead." And Calloway leaned forward, just slightly, the way a person leans forward when they believe they are about to win something. "You speak about Philip Harrison like he was a saint," Calloway said. "But I have spoken to people who knew your family, and they describe him very differently." The smile on Shaq's face did not vanish. It just stopped being a smile. What replaced it was harder to name. And it was not anger. Not yet. It was something quieter and more interior than anger. It was the look of a man who has just heard a familiar sound in an unfamiliar place. The sound of something he recognized from a long time ago. Something that used to be able to reach him when he was smaller and had fewer walls built up around the things he loved most. "What do you mean, differently?" Shaq said. His voice was level, careful. Calloway opened a folder on the desk in front of him. He did it slowly, deliberately, the way a person opens something when they want you to watch them open it. "I have spoken to individuals who knew the Harrison family during the years you lived in San Antonio and before, people who were close to the household." He glanced down at the folder, then back up. Words like controlling came up. Harsh. One person used the phrase iron fist. And I think what people want to understand is, when you build a foundation and put his name on it and hold him up as this model of fatherhood, Calloway paused for exactly 1 second too long. Are you being honest about who he really was? Or are you selling a version of him that keeps the donations coming in? The studio audience had gone so quiet that the air conditioning in the ceiling became the loudest thing in the room. Shaq looked at the folder, then at Calloway, then at the folder again. "Who did you speak to?" he asked. "I'm not able to share that." "You're making a serious claim about a man who cannot defend himself. A man who has been in the ground since 2013. And you won't tell me who told you this." "Journalism protects its sources," Calloway said. "But that is not journalism," Shaq said quietly. "That is cowardice, wearing journalism's clothes." Calloway's jaw tightened. "I'm asking a fair question about a public figure's legacy." "He was not a public figure," Shaq said, and his voice dropped another register, which should not have been possible, but it was. "He was my father. He woke up every morning of his life and loved his family with everything he had. He is not a story. He is not a segment. He is the reason I am sitting in this chair instead of somewhere I do not want to think about." He stopped. He breathed once. "You don't get to do this," he said. "Mr. O'Neill." "Shut your mouth." The words came out soft and final and absolute. He stood. The chair scraped back across the studio floor. His hands pressed flat on the desk. When he looked at Derek Calloway for 3 full seconds, not with rage, but with something that was the complete and total opposite of rage, with a kind of enormous, exhausted sadness. Then he reached down, unclipped the microphone from his shirt, and placed it on the table with the gentleness of someone setting down something that no longer belonged to them. And he walked. He walked past camera 1 and camera 2. He walked past Darius, the cameraman, who had lowered his shoulder away from the viewfinder and was standing with his arms at his sides like a soldier at attention, not knowing what else to do with his body. He walked past 3 production assistants who had arranged themselves in a loose, stunned cluster near the studio door, each one holding something, a clipboard, a coffee cup, under a phone that they had completely forgotten was in their hands. He walked past Sienna Morrow. She was standing very still with one hand pressed flat over her mouth. Her eyes were wet. Not crying. Not yet. But the kind of wet that comes right before crying, when the body has already decided what is going to happen, even if the person has not. Shaq slowed for just 1 step when he reached her. He did not stop, but he looked at her directly and said, very quietly, in a voice that only she could hear, "You knew." It was not said with cruelty. It was said with the weariness of a man who had hoped, right up until the last second, that he had been wrong about what was coming. Sienna Morrow closed her eyes. He kept walking. He passed Marcus in the hallway. Marcus, with his signed work glove, who took one look at Shaq's face and stepped back against the wall without a single word, understanding without being told that this was not a moment for conversation. Shaq pushed open the heavy exit door and stepped out onto Peachtree Street. The February air hit him immediately, cold and sharp and real in a way that the recycled studio air had not been. He stood on the sidewalk and breathed it in, once, twice, a third time. His breath made small white clouds that dissolved almost before they formed. Around him, Atlanta continued its Tuesday morning with complete indifference. A delivery truck rumbled past. Somewhere above him, 2 pigeons argued on a window ledge. A woman walked by with a coffee cup and headphones in and did not look up. The world did not know yet. It would know very soon. He pulled out his phone and did not call his publicist, Renata Ossi, though she would call him in approximately 4 minutes. He did not call his manager or his lawyer or Charles Barkley, though all three of them would reach him before the hour was up. He scrolled past all of them and called his daughter. Tahira O'Neill answered on the second ring. "Dad." Just his name, but said in a way that already contained a question. He told her what had happened. He stood on the sidewalk on Peachtree Street and told her the whole thing. Calloway's folder, the unnamed sources, the words controlling and harsh, the suggestion that the foundation was something built for selfish reasons rather than love. His voice was steady for most of it. It cracked once on the word father, and only once, and he kept going. Tahira listened to every word without interrupting. That was one of the things about her that had always undone him in the best possible way. She listened the way Philip Harrison had listened, completely, without preparing her response while you were still talking. When he finished, there was a short silence. Then she said, "Dad, Grandpa knew who he was. You knew who he was. Nobody sitting behind a desk in a television studio gets to change that. Not ever." Shaq stood on the sidewalk. A pigeon landed near his shoe, looked up at him briefly with its small orange eye, and walked away. "Yeah," he said finally. His voice was quieter now, settled. "Come home," Tahira said. He was still standing there, phone against his ear, when the first notification appeared on the screen. Then another. Then another. But arriving so fast, they stopped being individual notifications and became a single, continuous vibration in his hand. The video had hit the internet. 7 million views was still hours away. But it had started. The world was waking up to what had happened in that studio. And it had one question, and it would not stop asking it until the answer came. 3 days later, it began to get one. The first day, Shaq said nothing publicly. Renata Osei put out a statement that was exactly 2 sentences long, written in the careful, neutral language that publicists use when they are buying time for the truth to organize itself. Shaquille O'Neal concluded the interview due to comments he found deeply disrespectful toward his family. He will be speaking in his own time and in his own way. Your Derek Calloway and the Pulse Sports Network moved in the opposite direction with impressive speed. By noon on that first day, the network had published a statement calling the interview a demonstration of the kind of fearless questioning that powerful figures consistently tried to avoid. They used the word accountability 4 times in 6 paragraphs. They said that Shaq's reaction was itself revealing. They said that walking away from hard questions was not something the public should admire. They said all of this without once saying what the hard questions actually were. The Internet did what the Internet does. It split cleanly and immediately down the middle. Half the people who watched the clip, the 37 seconds of footage that showed only the final moments, Shaq rising, the microphone going down, the walk, said that whatever Calloway had said, a man of Shaq's stature and platform should have stayed and answered it. Public figures, they argued, did not get to choose their comfort over accountability. The other half said that a man defending the memory of his dead father was not avoiding accountability. It was called love. And love, they said, did not owe a television network an explanation. Nobody on either side actually knew the full content of what Calloway had said. The clip had no clear audio of the exchange. So everyone argued from assumption, which is the most exhausting kind of argument because it never ends and never moves. On the second day, Sienna Morrow changed everything. She posted a statement from her personal account. 3 paragraphs, no network logo behind it, no legal review, just a woman saying what she had seen. She had resigned that morning, she wrote. She had raised concerns before the interview. Those concerns had been dismissed. She would not detail everything publicly, but she would say this much. There is a difference between a hard question and a deliberate wound. Anyone who cannot see that difference should not be in a room with a microphone. The third day belonged to Shaq. He posted at 2:14 in the morning. Not a video. Not a press conference. Just words, typed by his own hands, in his own voice, with no publicist smoothing the edges or lawyer checking the corners. He wrote about Philip Harrison. He wrote about the hospital room in 2013 and holding his father's hand while the machines around them made their quiet, indifferent sounds. He wrote about Germany and San Antonio, and a split lip he came home with once as a 9-year-old boy, and how Philip Harrison had sat him down and listened to every single word of the story before asking, calmly and without judgment, whether there had been a better choice available before it reached fists. He wrote, "That man was not perfect, no man is, but he showed up every single day. He loved us with everything he had, and then a little more on top of that. To sit in a studio and have someone with unnamed sources and a ratings problem suggest otherwise is not journalism. It is something ugly dressed up in journalism's clothes. I walked off because I will not sit still while something ugly happens in front of me. My father taught me that too." 4 million people liked the post before sunrise. 12 days later, No Filter with Derek Calloway was canceled, and the network called it a programming decision. Everyone understood what it actually was, but the real story, the one with the answer buried inside it, the one that explained not just what Calloway had said, but who had handed him the shovel to dig with, that story did not arrive until 3 months later. It arrived quietly, the way truth usually does, in the pages of a magazine called The Quarter, written by a journalist named Priya Venkatesh, who had spent those 3 months doing what Derek Calloway had only pretended to do, actually talking to people, actually listening to what they said, actually caring whether it was true. What she found was this: the unnamed sources Calloway had cited, the people who had described Philip Harrison as controlling, as harsh, as something other than what Shaq had always known him to be, were 2 people. One was a former neighbor who had lived near the Harrison family for less than 11 months in the early 1980s and had not spoken to any of them since Ronald Reagan was president. The other was a man named Calvin Reed. Calvin Reed was the cousin of Joe Toney, the biological father, the one who had left Newark before Shaquille was old enough to understand leaving, the one whose absence had carved that father-shaped hole that Philip Harrison had spent 20 years quietly, faithfully filling. The one Shaq had almost never spoken about publicly, because some wounds are private, not because you are ashamed of them, but because you have chosen not to let them define you. Calvin Reed had contacted Derek Calloway's production team 6 weeks before the interview. He had offered what he called inside information about the Harrison household. Priya Venkatesh had confirmed, through 2 separate sources close to Reed, that he had done this at the request of Joe Toney himself, now an old man, living alone in Newark, New Jersey, having had no meaningful contact with his son in decades. Joe Toney had not reached out with regret. He had not reached out with an apology or a letter, or any of the things a father who understood what he had lost might have reached out with. He had reached out with chaos, with an attempt to pull down the man who had replaced him in the story, to make Philip Harrison smaller so that his own absence might feel, to some small and shameful part of himself more justified. A Derek Calloway had known exactly where his information came from. He had used it anyway. The Harrison Foundation held its first major fundraising event in Orlando, Florida, on March 6th, Shaquille O'Neal's 52nd birthday. 430 children attended from 6 different states. There were basketball drills and mentorship workshops, and a meal that Shaq insisted on funding entirely from his own pocket. At one point in the afternoon, he sat cross-legged on a gymnasium floor in a circle of 12-year-olds and answered every question they had. A small boy from Baton Rouge named Antoine raised his hand near the end. "Did you really walk off that show?" he asked. "I did," Shaq said. "Were you scared?" Shaq thought about that honestly, when the way Philip Harrison had always taught him to think about questions, all the way through, not just to the first comfortable answer. "No," he said. "I was sad." Antoine nodded slowly, turning that over. "Why sad?" "Because some people try to make you feel small by making the people you love feel small. And the sad part is not that they try." Shaq looked at the boy steadily. "The sad part is they believe it will work." Antoine was quiet for a moment. Outside the gymnasium windows, the Florida sun was doing what it always does in March, burning so cleanly and completely that everything beneath it looked washed new. "Did it work?" Antoine asked. Shaq shook his head. "No, son," he said. "It did not." The room was quiet, not an uncomfortable quiet, and the kind of quiet that arrives after something true has been said out loud in a room full of people who needed to hear it. Somewhere in Newark, New Jersey, an old man sat alone with whatever he sat alone with. Somewhere in Atlanta, a canceled show's studio stood dark and empty on Peachtree Street. And in a gymnasium full of children in Orlando, on the birthday of a man who had been told his whole life to take up less space, Shaquille O'Neal sat on the floor among the smallest people in the room and took up exactly as much space as love required. Which, as it turned out, was all of it. Philip Harrison had told his son more than once in more than one city, across more than one decade of showing up when another man had chosen not to. Real men do not belittle others to feel tall. In a small studio on Peachtree Street, on a cold Tuesday morning in February, a microphone was placed gently on a desk, and a son proved, once and for all, that he had been listening. Note on Real Facts: all details regarding Shaquille O'Neal: his birth date, birthplace, biological father, Joe Toney, stepfather Philip Harrison, and his death on July 27, 2013, NBA career, championships, LSU career, under Dale Brown, Robert G. Cole High School, Barry University doctorate, and daughter Tahira are accurate. Derek Calloway, Sienna Morrow, Renata Osei, Priya Venkatesh, Calvin Reed, Marcus, Darius, Antoine, The Pulse Sports Network, No Filter with Derek Calloway, and The Quarter Magazine are all fictional creations for this story. Before you go, drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. We have people tuning in from all over the world, and we love seeing where our family is coming from. If this story moved you even a little, if it made you think about the people who showed up for you, the ones who loved you quietly and without conditions, hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it helps more people find stories like this one. And if you believe that kindness is worth spreading, that the world needs more voices standing up for the people they love, then subscribe to this channel. Join the family. We tell stories that actually mean something, and we are just getting started. One last thing. There is a video appearing on your screen right now. Click on it. We picked it just for you. and we think you are really going to feel that one too. We will see you there.